So, Duane, thank you so much for joining in this conversation series, The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. And I'd like to begin, as I do with all my guests, which is inviting them to share, who they are and what they're known for, because not everybody who views this will be familiar with your work. I think most people will, but certainly there will be some who aren't. So help us get who Duane Elgin is, what you're particularly passionate about or committed to, or what you've been known for.
Michael, thank you. It's such an honor to be here and to share this time with you. Uh, as in terms of background, I grew up on a farm in Idaho, so I'm a farm boy at heart. But I had the great privilege of going to graduate school, getting in an MBA from the Wharton Business School and such. My first job out of college was working on a presidential commission, looking 30 years into the future. And that gave me my introduction to futures research. And after a couple of years working in Washington, I moved to California and I began working on futures research there.
Mm-hmm.
And my first job was spending a year working with Joseph Campbell, the extraordinary scholar of the deep archetypes of human evolution, looking at humanity's future. So my background is really as a scholar looking at the deep archetypes of human evolution, our time of great transition as a human species, as well as working on the more practical aspects of life. I wrote a book called Voluntary Simplicity about how we can live more sustainably, create a future of sustainable prosperity. And lastly, I've been very passionate about media and how the mass media can be a vehicle for transforming the mass mind. And in that process, we can realize, as you suggest, our greatness as a human family. So that's a bit of background.
That's great. And just for the viewers, just to let you know, I'll be turning my video off while Duane is speaking because I don't have great bandwidth here. And that way we can make sure that he doesn't cut out. But yeah, that was great. I mean, my first introduction to you, I actually, in preparation for this interview, I had a memory. I think it was 92, there was an event that you were at and I was at, and Brian Swim and Matthew Fox, and I so looked up to you and to Brian and to Matt, and I was, sort of a nobody at that point. Very few people had heard of me. I wrote my first book, Earth Spirit, but I don't even know that we interacted then. I just sort of held the three of you up as sort of my older brothers on the path. And so it's such a delight to now have just a really great friendship and collegial relationship with the three of you.
Yeah.
But my first experience of you, I think, was in your book, Awakening Earth. And I found that volume to be so powerful in helping me both. I had been very anti-media, very anti-television. I still don't watch, I have an addictive personality, so I gave up watching TV decades ago. But I found your articulation there of sort of the larger collective and our relationship to it, and then you're sharing sort of how some of this wisdom and insight came through meditation. So I just found that book to be tremendously inspiring. And then your little volume, Promise Ahead, I for many years was recommending and buying it, and actually Connie and I, our first 4 or 5 years on the road, we were selling that, so you helped us stay in gas and food money, so I thank you for that. But your ability to frame spiritual matters in a deeply ecological, evolutionary context and help us to look at the scary stuff and the shadow side stuff, but to see possibility in that has been a real gift, both to me and to many others. And so as we sort of lean into this question, how might the future be calling us to greatness collectively? One of the metaphors that you talked a lot about in Promise Ahead is this sort of a maturation metaphor that we're growing up, not just waking up, but we're growing up as a species. And I know in some of your public programs you've done this whole exercise. So could you say a little bit about that in terms of how you see humanity in the maturing process, sort of in that adolescent stage, growing up, and how does that vision inspire you and how you found it inspiring to others?
Great. Wonderful question, because this is a question I've been asking for almost 2 decades around the world. And often when I go out and I give a talk, I will begin by asking the assembled audience, before I begin, let me ask you a question. The question is a very simple one, and it is, what do you think is the life stage of the human family? And I give people four choices. We're in our toddler stage as a species, we're in our teenage stage, our adult stage, or elder. Toddler, teenager, adult, or elder. And so I've asked this question around the world. And initially, I didn't know how people would respond. I didn't know if people would understand it. I didn't know how people would respond to it. The stunning thing is, people around the world have a similar perspective, and roughly 3/4 of any audience I've asked will say, we are in our teenage stage as a human family. We're in our adolescence. We're behaving like teenagers. And whether it's school teachers in India, spiritual leaders in Japan, business leaders in South America, in Europe, and so on. All around the world, there is this consensus that we're behaving like teenagers. And so if we are going to achieve our greatness, one requirement is to move from our adolescence and into our early adulthood. Yes. And if we can move into our early adulthood, that will be transformative, just as it is. I have 3 sons. So just as it is for my sons moving from their adolescence to adulthood, it's transformative. If we can do that as a human family, I feel we are going to begin moving into our greatness. And Joseph Campbell, this extraordinary scholar of human evolution, said there are 3 things that happen as we move into our early maturity. He said the first thing is a new relationship with the earth. And for us, that would be more sustainable. The second thing is a new relationship with the rest of life, plants, animals, and other humans, a more compassionate relationship. And thirdly, a new relationship with the universe, a sacred regard for the universe, not just assuming it's there and taking it for granted, but rather bringing it into our consciousness and giving a sacred regard for that.
Yeah. Well, that last that was a great summing up of those 3 points, because I think that really is. And one of the books I read last year, I reread, was Martin Buber's famous book I and Thou, and he talked about that honorable relationship, that personal relationship with reality. And of course, that's what so much of your writing has been about, as well as Joseph Campbell. With that sense of coming into a deeper, more intimate communion with Earth, with other creatures, and with the cosmos as a whole, one of the metaphors I know that you've been really, even more than a metaphor, but one of the ways of thinking and seeing that's been, I know, at the heart of some of your more recent writings is this sense of a living universe, that we're living in a living cosmos, and that to use dead mechanistic metaphors rather than living metaphors for reality, nature, the universe, cosmos, whatever, may be deadly. We may not be able to survive that. So could you say a little bit more about sort of how you see the healthiest of relationships between humanity and the larger body of life of which we're a part and upon which we depend utterly? And then what does it mean to give Earth a voice, to be the voice of Earth, to be the self-reflexive consciousness, and to give voice to that?
Great. Well, I think one of the deepest transitions that we're in the process of making as a human family is, over the last 300 years or so, science has viewed the universe as essentially non-living at the foundations, essentially dead matter and empty space. And increasingly, there's evidence of some kind of unique sentience or aliveness that permeates the foundations of reality. And this is not going back to the superstitions of the earlier era, but going ahead and going forward into new insights from the frontiers of science. And so it's not to say this proves the universe is a living system, but rather it seems to have the qualities of aliveness.
Yes.
And if we are living in a living universe, well, that transforms how we regard ourselves because life exists within life. We are much bigger beings than just these physical bodies. These bodies are the vehicles of divinity. Um, these are the tools through which we express our divinity, and it's also the tools through which we receive that understanding of life within life.
Mm-hmm.
So, the second part of your question, how do we give voice to our larger sense of aliveness as a human family?
Yes.
And I think that one of the key transitions we are going to make as a human family is finding our collective voice.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to move into our collective greatness, we need to find our collective voice. And the wonderful thing about what is happening now in the world is that the internet right now has makes it possible for about 2 billion people with cell phones to talk to one another if we in fact knew how to do that.
Uh-huh.
But we have the technology to do that. We don't yet have the social understanding of how to use that technology. But I think in the very near future, with climate change and species extinction and all the rest, the human family is going to say, enough. Well, let's stand above the politics of gridlock. Let's bring a new consciousness and a new consensus to how we move into the future. Let's tell our politicians that it's time for action.
Yes.
It's past time for the politics of gridlock. It's time to act collectively for a future of more sustainable prosperity.
Yeah. And
the thing is, everyone has, there it is, that's the technology that will transform the world. So we are learning how to use our collective intelligence to create a new collective voice, and out of that, a new collective consensus for a more promising pathway into the future.
Yeah, that's great, Duane. In fact, I was reminded, as you were just sharing, of something that you and Jane Blewett and I think a couple of others worked on, a report back maybe 20 years ago now, of all the different ways that we're already cooperating internationally that a lot of people don't know of. I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of that.
Oh, just it's so, we overlook the ways in which we are working as a human family. For example, just the fact that we can communicate over the internet and globally, there's the allocation of the communication spectrum, and we've agreed as a human family how we're going to allocate that communication spectrum. That's extraordinary. Mm-hmm. The fact that we fly airplanes around the world, we have to coordinate all of those flight patterns and make that all work together. Even if we do have some hostilities, we're still cooperating in terms of flight patterns. Mm-hmm. In terms of weather, we cooperate in terms of letting one another know about weather patterns around the world. Health, we've essentially eradicated smallpox and polio. Mm-hmm. And that is a global international initiative. So if you look at all of these areas of transportation and health and all the rest, we are already well along the way of learning how to cooperate and work together as a human family. So this isn't something that's brand new to us. It's something we've been doing already for decades. Yep. It's simply to expand that capacity into a much larger realm.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I had forgotten that body of work of yours, and I'm really glad that you reminded me of it. You know, one of the things that, again, where I found your work and others have as well valuable is this emphasis both on global cooperation and sort of Earth awakening, and that humans are a part of nature in that awakening, maturing process. I like the maturing metaphor. In fact, this evening, I'm doing a program at a church in Lincoln, Nebraska, First Plymouth United Church of Christ. It's pastored by Jim Keck, who was corresponding with him, and I said, because another one of my older brothers and intellectual mentors was Bob Keck, Robert Keck, and he also used that maturing metaphor. And I asked Jim in an email, I said, "You aren't related to the late Bob Keck by any chance?" And he said, "Yeah, he was my dad." So we're going to get together for a tea this afternoon, and I'm just really looking forward to that, because his father was such an important intellectual mentor. But one of the challenges that we're facing now as a species is, how do we deal with conflicting worldviews, values, and I know that you've had contributions in this area in terms of truth and reconciliation and conflict resolution, and how do we come to agreements and come to understanding, and simply to really hear each other. So anything that you'd like to share in that realm would be appreciated.
Yeah, I feel that perhaps the most fundamental quality of the emerging era for the human family, as we make this great transition to a more sustainable future, will be truth and reconciliation. We need to begin telling ourselves the truth about how deeply divided we are as a human family. And let's just look at this briefly. We're divided not only between men and women, gender issues, we're divided by income, we're divided by race, we're divided by ethnicity, we're divided by religious conflict, we're divided by species, it's us against the other species, we're divided by generations, we're consuming it all now. We can just go on and on. The divisions in the human family are extraordinary. And
rather depressing if all we are is aware of them without honoring them in the way that you're talking about. That can be pretty depressing.
Depressing and lethal. Look at what we're doing in the Middle East and so on. Our future depends, in my estimation, on our ability to tell the truth about what's going on with ourselves and the world. And then begin the process out of that truth, that honesty of what's happening, of reconciliation. Now, reconciliation doesn't mean forgetting it. It means bringing it into awareness so it will not be forgotten. Yes. And if it's in awareness and it won't be forgotten, well, then we are no longer held hostage by something that's secret and underneath the public sphere, but rather it has been brought into public awareness, and we can then work from reconciliation towards restoration. Yes. We can begin to respond to the wrongs and the wounds of history, if you will. We can begin to heal the wounds of history. And with that healing, we can then move into a phase of a real bonding as a human family. But we can't bond as a human family if we haven't done the healing first. So we have some really profound work to do as a human family to heal the wounds of history across all of those different areas, and that will take generations, in my estimation, to accomplish.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And I think that one of the lessons that I learned from big history, from the epic of evolution or the great story, is that chaos and breakdowns keep catalyzing creative transformation. And so I think some of the challenges that we're likely to see and are already beginning to experience in this century will be precisely those things that almost force us to listen to each other and to resolve conflict and to have a different relationship to our differences. I know, speaking very personally, one of the great transformations in coming to embrace a sacred understanding of evolution and ecology is how I view differences. I used to view differences as a problem to be solved, basically, and I now view differences as a solution to our problems. But we have to find ways of coming to collective intelligence around our differences rather than just continuing to fight the same old fights that our grandparents fought.
Great.
Well, Duane, you and I share a common admiration for Arnold Toynbee and his historical work, and I know that one of the things that your book, Voluntary Simplicity. A lot of people don't know is that Toynbee suggested that the greatness of a civilization is not measured in the ways that we often think it is. And so there's a twist. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for bringing Toynbee in. Ernest Toynbee was one of the great historians of the modern era. He wrote volume after volume after volume on the rise and fall of civilizations throughout history. And he looked at the rise and fall of more than 20 civilizations, trying to understand what's going on here. How would you describe the growth of a civilization? And after decades, he finally summarized these volumes and volumes of work in one simple law. And he said he called it the law of progressive simplification, the law of progressive simplification. And he said the measure of a civilization's success and growth, its greatness, is not in its power over people or its acquisition of more and more land. He said that the greatness of a civilization was to be measured by its ability to minimize the material side of life and move more and more energy and attention to the non-material side of life, to learning, to education, to the arts, music, poetry, and on and on. And he said that to the extent that we only emphasize the material side and neglect the non-material side of life, that may be a civilization of power, but it's not a civilization of greatness. And if we want to achieve our greatness as a society, we need to begin lightening up on the material side and increasing our investment and our celebration and the blossoming of the non-material side of life. And really, that's what simplicity is about, is to say, well, let's have a life that is outwardly more simple, but is inwardly more rich, and the two will balance one another out and create a future for all of us of more sustainable prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. I mean, one of the things that is sort of unique about Connie's and my lifestyle for the last decade is that we live by choice a very simple lifestyle. We live out of the generosity of others who open up their homes to us. And we have very few possessions. We don't have a home. We don't have an apartment. We have almost everything that we own in our van. I mean, we do have a little bit stored at somebody else's house. But and yet we have the felt experience that we're the richest people on the planet. That we get to do this work at this time in history, with each other. And it's just extraordinary. So it's a wealth beyond measure that we feel. We feel like we're richer than kings, even though we're technically homeless. It's quite extraordinary. So
you're an inspiration, Michael.
Well, I don't.
You're an inspiration. Yeah.
Thanks for saying that. But most people don't envy us. Let's put it that way. Most people, don't wish that they could live sort of on the road. But say a little bit about living. I was just reading Time Magazine. I think last week's issue of Time Magazine. We're having this conversation in July, even though this won't be aired until November. But it was on the smarter home. The dwellings of the future will make you calmer, safer, richer, and healthier, and they already exist. It's about sort of, one of the things I know we have to move into is using less material things and yet using them smarter so that we live in eco homes, in eco villages, and eco cities, and how do we do that? We're not obviously not going to do that overnight, but clearly that's the direction we have to move in. And I know that you either still do or have lived in co-housing. Could you say a little bit about how we live our lives in community and how that can give us great wealth even while we find our lives simplifying?
Yes. Someone once said that our current lifestyle in the United States, for example, with all of these individual family dwellings, each replicating what's in the next, is the equivalent of a small, underdeveloped country. Because we're so disconnected from one another, we don't take advantage of the resources that are there in the larger community. Rather, where we are kind of encapsulated within the resources that we have within our particular house or apartment. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to live sustainably on the earth, we need to live more efficiently. And if we're going to live more efficiently, we need to learn how to share the wealth and resources that we have. And so I did have the opportunity with my wife to live in co-housing for several years. We lived in a community with 70 people, 50 adults, 20 kids. And it was architecturally designed to be very efficient. Twice a week, we would eat together in the common house as a community. We would do work together on the land. We would do political actions together. We would go dancing together. We would have music coming into the co-housing community and so on. And it just transformed our experience of life and living and how we could share tools and equipment and food and all the rest with other people. And so it was a very efficient way of living, and at the same time, a very impactful way to come together in community, not only to enjoy good food together, but then to engage in political action together, to learn together, and so on. So I feel that as we move towards a more sustainable future, one thing we're going to have to do is retrofit. Not only create new structures, but we have already built so many structures that need to be retrofitted and integrated into some kind of sustainable community. For example, in Sacramento, California, and in Davis, California, there are examples where on a suburban block, they've torn down the fences, the back fences of the housing. And so that has created a huge open space area for kids to play, to create gardens, to create a new kind of interior community that goes with that block of suburban housing. And I think we're going to be in a period of invention like that to reinvent how we live together more sustainably and live more lightly on the earth.
Yeah. Amen. I mean, I see that also. Connie and I, one of the benefits of traveling the continent for 12 years is we've gotten this chance to see how things have changed over the course of even longer than a decade. And this drive to simplify and to build community or to nurture community or foster community. I mean, there's this recognition, a growing recognition. Obviously, everybody's not there, but there's a growing recognition that we are by nature tribal beings, and we only thrive in the same way that bees only thrive when they can have a beehive. Human beings thrive in community, which is not to say that there can't be stifling elements of community. Of course there can, right. But nonetheless, we thrive. We don't thrive if we're isolated. You know, mom and dad living isolated from community, isolated from even extended family, trying to raise their kids. It's no wonder that so many people are on, antidepressants and things like that. We don't have what we need to survive and thrive as a human species, as individuals, which is that community and that sense of that we live in a sacred universe. Right. How we think about our inner nature, our outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature, how we either honor or dishonor those, has a profound difference in terms of the quality of our own life and the quality of our legacy. So I'm wondering, could you say a little bit about what wakes you up when you wake up on any given day or week, and you think of it, it's Monday morning and you're looking at your week, or you wake up someday. What is it that most inspires you to do the work that you do? What keeps you from being overwhelmed or depressed by the big and some of it quite scary stuff on the horizon?
Well, let's see. What wakes me up in the morning? Truthfully, this is somewhat difficult to communicate, but it's the aliveness of life itself. It's that I wake up and I feel I'm not just sitting here in a universe that's indifferent to me, it doesn't know me, it doesn't care about me. I'm sitting here in the midst of blossoming aliveness of a universe in which I'm intimately connected. I feel its connection with me. It's kind of subtle, quiet, nurturing of me really wakes me up.
Mm-hmm.
And so every morning I spend half an hour to an hour meditating.
Mm-hmm.
And in that meditation, what I am really opening to is the gift of aliveness that's infusing the universe, and my ability then to connect with that larger dance of life. And so in that, it relieves some of the stresses, the pressures, and so on, because I know underneath all of the stresses of everyday life, there's a deeper ground of being, a ground of aliveness that sustains us,
Mm-hmm.
that wants us to succeed, even though it's not going to interfere with our lives. It's there in support of our existence. So that's really what brings me alive, and uh, it's that sacred regard for the universe that you were speaking of, Michael, and that we are learning how to come into a sacred relationship with that sacred universe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. You used the word sacred, and I know that's one that I use a lot myself, because I feel that profound sense of just the gift of being able to be alive. And then with every breath, I am nourished by the contributions of other beings. And that with every bite of food, I'm nourished by to my religious way of saying it, the body of God. I mean, you know, it's like the fact that we eat other creatures, it's almost like the body of life is saying, take, eat, this is my body, which is
That's
given
right.
for you. It's like Holy Communion at the scale of the entire body of life, which
That's beautifully said. Yes.
so one of the exercises I know that I've done with groups. In fact, I've mentioned this in at least one or two of the other interviews. But you also have had contributions in this area, so I want to ask you about it. There's an exercise which is to find where your joy and the world's needs intersect, because our times are
Yes.
calling for all of us to contribute in whatever ways that we can. Our gifts are needed. And in fact, what I sometimes say is that I say this to audiences, you know, the universe doesn't just need your gifts. The universe needs your shortcomings. You know, like, be fully yourself, you know? And so could you say a little bit about how all of us are being called to action, and it doesn't have to be something great or majestic. It's like where your joy and the world's needs intersect. So could
Yeah.
you say anything you want to about that?
I really appreciate your enthusiasm, Michael. And yes, well, we are being called to greatness. And it's the unique greatness that we each can bring to the world. And I ask audiences often to reflect on the following. Each of us have what might be called true gifts, things that we're really soulfully gifted at bringing to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And each of us has near gifts, things that we're pretty good at. And I say often we are living out our lives by using our near gifts rather than our true gifts. And for example, we might be selling real estate. We might be really good at selling real estate. But our true gift might be music, it might be poetry, it might be art, it might be something that isn't going to be quite so economically remunerative, but it would be a gift of joy and love and transformation to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to step back from the urgencies of modern life and see what is it in our heart, in our soul, that we are uniquely gifted at bringing to the world, and trusting that those gifts that we uniquely have will be the gifts that the world most needs. And my sense is that our times are so demanding that our near gifts are not going to be good enough. The way we're going to make it through this time of great transition is with our true gifts, the highest and best that we have to give. And I do trust that if all of us were to turn to our true gifts and give those to the world, that we would have a future of extraordinary promise and opportunity. So, yes.
That's fabulous. In fact, that it almost cycles back to simplicity, because if your needs are not large, if you live in a small house and don't have a lot of debt and don't have a lot of expenses, then that provides more opportunity for you to exercise your, as you say, your true gifts, what you're lit up about, what you're passionate about, the various artistic and other creative expressions that are difficult if you have a lot of expenses on a monthly basis. So you have to earn so much income. So it kind of comes back to that simplicity.
It does.
Well, you used a phrase that we haven't touched on yet in this interview, and yet I really want to, because it's something that I know has been at the heart of your work, which is the sense that we are in a great transition. We talked a little bit about the sort of growing up, but this phrase, the great transition, what do you see us transitioning out of, and where do you see this transition moving us into?
A core question, Michael. Basically, there are many transitions underway all at the same time. And we've already spoken about some of these. The transition from, let's say, a non-living to a living universe. That's a provisional perspective. It's not fully agreed upon. But nonetheless, we're making a transition from some kind of dead universe to some kind of greater aliveness. Mm-hmm. We talked about the transition from our adolescence and into our adulthood as a human family, the transition from a species that is deeply divided across many different dimensions to a species that feels a greater sense of communion and community with others. Mm-hmm. Other areas of division, we are on a heroic journey. We've been separated as a human family, growing in separation from one another, separation from the universe, separation from nature and the rest of life. And now we're coming to a time of great crisis, resource depletion, species extinction, climate disruption, and all the rest. And this crisis says, no, now we need to come back from separation and into communion with the universe, with one another, and so on. So there are all of these different dimensions of transition and change that are underway. And people have used many different metaphors from, let's say, the butterfly emerging from the chrysalis. So we have been essentially caterpillars trying to figure out how to fly, and we're going through this time of great transition as in the chrysalis stage of the species. So there are all of these metaphors that we could be using. We're in a time of planetary birth, and women will say, listen, the birth process is really painful. It's very difficult. But on the other side of that difficulty and pain is new life. New life is being born here. So there are all kinds of metaphors that we can use, but the metaphors point us in the direction of a deep and profound transition, the likes of which the human family has never experienced. And in no small part because the circle is closed. This is a unified world that we now live in. There's no frontier to escape. And so we are doing this for the very first time in human history all together. It's something that we are doing all together for the very first time. And so there's no prior experience with this. And it would be understandable that we would make mistakes as we go through this process of learning. But it's, I think, the most profound time of transition that the human species has ever encountered.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I particularly appreciate about the multiple metaphors that you just offered is a richer way to speak about what I've been speaking about in terms of what I believe that we're experiencing, just about to experience in an even more major way, the Great Reckoning. That is where we've been out of right relationship to reality and now about to experience the consequences of that. But also that, I think, can be the great homecoming. Humanity, sort of the prodigal species, waking up to our predicament after squandering our inheritance and now being forced by life's conditions, by God, reality, the universe, nature, cosmos, to cooperate at a scale we've never had to do before, and to learn from each other, and to rely on each other, and to co-create and with each other. And one of my heroes, one of the people that I read most, is John Michael Greer, and he talks a lot about sort of the rising and contraction of civilizations. But I agree with you fully that we've never been in a situation where we have to rely globally on each other. No nation can solve this. No religious group can solve this. The challenges in the 21st century are such that it's, in my opinion, it's quite possible that in the 22nd, 23rd, 24th centuries, assuming we survive, that we'll measure time in a different way. That the way of measuring time, BC AD, I think may pass because there may be larger sort of things that recalibrate us. I don't know, but so I want to sort of shift focus here as we begin to wind down, and I ask a question that I've been asking. I think I've only forgotten to ask it maybe in one or two interviews, and that is, and Connie was the one that invited me to ask this, folks, and that is that if you could invite three people from any time in human history to dinner, or a cup of coffee or tea or whatever, a beer, a glass of wine. But if you were to have a one-on-one conversation over a meal or a drink with any three people in history, now it could be a dinner party where all three of them and you, all four of you, are together at one dinner party, or it could be one-on-one, either way. But who would those three people be, and why would you invite them?
Beautiful question. Golly, let's see. Would they all be vegetarians, Michael? What would we have for dinner? Okay,
well, you can simplify it just over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or whatever.
No, I'm teasing. I'm kidding you. Okay, the three people. It would be Jesus,
okay,
the Buddha,
okay,
and Rumi. So it would be getting spiritual perspectives from three different traditions, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I would just love to sit there and listen to the likes of Jesus, the Buddha, and Rumi speak about life and what we're doing here and the human condition, particularly if we could bring them into the modern setting and have them watch a few minutes of television and such before then turning it off and diving into our dinner together.
Well, I think a few minutes of television might be a bit confusing.
It would.
But it would certainly make, it's interesting because Brian McLaren, who's a leader in the emerging church movement, sort of progressive, sort of postmodernist Christianity, he said Jesus, the Buddha, and Muhammad, and he said as long as they had enough of a knowledge about what's been revealed through science and evidence about our cosmos, and so that their knowledge base was up to date, but then to hear these hearts, these minds, these souls interact in light of what we now know would be fascinating. And so it's very similar to yours.
Totally.
That's great. Well, Duane, anything else that you'd like to share on this theme that the past is rooting for us and the future is calling us to greatness? Any last things that you'd like to share? And then how can people learn? What's the best place or places so people can learn more about your work and go deeper into it?
Yeah. I just affirm that what you're saying, Michael, these are extraordinary times. We've thought in the past that we were in a time of great transition with a world war and this and that. But truly, now with the world unified as a singular whole, with climate and species and all the rest, this is the time of great transition as a human family. And it is calling us to a larger greatness, our greatness both individually and then collectively. And these are very dangerous times. On the one hand, I see the real possibility of denial continuing, and people trying to perpetuate business as usual. But on the other hand, I see a number of people saying, no, we're in despair. It's too late. We've already crossed these critical thresholds and tipping points. And so we have really, in a way, two cultures, one of denial, one of despair. And what you and I are saying is, let's open this up.
Yes.
Let's open up the range between denial and despair and look at opportunity
Yes.
that's in the middle of all of that. So you and I are trying to call out opportunity in the face of people that want to deny there's any problem. On the other hand, people that are so in denial that are saying there's no way to solve it. So we're in this juicy, in a way, confusing and a creative middle ground of opportunity.
Yes.
So I really want to celebrate and affirm the work that you and Connie have done over the years. Just so inspiring to me in terms of the opportunity that we have to transform how we live. So in terms of additional materials about the work that I've been doing, there are two websites I would suggest. One is the greattransitionstories.org, greattransitionstories.org, and that has over a dozen stories, narratives about how we're making a transition as a human family. Number two would be my personal website, and there's all kinds of free materials on the website, and it is www.duaneelgin.com. DuaneElgin.com.
That's great. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the great transitionstories.org because, everybody's, not everybody, but most people are familiar with sort of the hero's myth and the pattern that Joseph Campbell talked about in terms of the monomyth. But a lot of people aren't aware that there are other profound storylines, there are other ways of framing things mythically that are also deeply inspiring, and that there's work to be done in terms of empowering the filmmakers and the novel writers and the people who are doing that work. And so greattransitionstories.org, there's just a wealth of information there. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Well, Duane, thank you, brother. I love you.
I love you.
Love to Colleen. Thank you so much for taking the time to join with me in this, and just blessings on your work. I'm thrilled to hear, as I shared with you in an email, that you'll also be speaking at the Big History Conference. Ruffling a few feathers there. So
I wish you were there.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, Duane. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.